the next chapter is the movement of the squares.
Yeah.
And actually, the discussion will continue. It's both Marissa Holmes and Carminda McLaurin will join the panel, because it's basically, you already heard in the World Social Forum debate the mention of the square movements from 2011, how it's also people who are active in World Social Forum were part of the square movements, such as Marissa Holmes was one of the key figures in Occupy Wall Street in New York. So you will hear in the next chapter also a talk by Marissa Holmes. So we carry out this discussion to the square movements, which started very strongly in 2011, but already before that in the countries like Greece and Iran.
And as you have seen in the program, in this program, the entire symposium, we're covering these 2 major anniversaries plus 9 different movements over the last decade. There are many other movements, and we obviously can be found out lacking in certain ways. We can't do everything at once, but please, if you have comments, if you have suggestions, put it in the chat. Join us in the plenary. We need your comments and questions. Now to the presentation of the next chapter.
The movement of the squares chapter will also present its current movements. Basically, we already have seen this is how people have gathered in Belarus, in Russia. And in this chapter, we will have a very powerful presentation of the farmers' movement from India, which is happening right now, which started in August, and which is actually the biggest movement in the human history.
David Graeber helped organize the initial Occupy Wall Street protests September 17, 2011, and was credited with helping to coin the phrase, "We are the 99%. He wrote on his website, "It was a communal effort." He said, "I did first suggest that we call ourselves the 99%, then 2 Spanish indignados and a Greek anarchist added the we, and later a Food Not Bombs veteran put the R between them, and they say you can't create something worthwhile by committee." In 2011, David Graeber spoke on Democracy Now! 2 days after the Occupy encampment began.
And start rebuilding society as we'd like to see it.
David Graeber, talk about debt cancellation.
Well, one of the things that I discovered in researching my book is that the kind of debt crisis we're experiencing now, I think the real debt crisis, which is a debt crisis that affects ordinary people, debts between the very wealthy or between governments can always be renegotiated and always have been throughout world history. They're not anything set in stone. It's generally speaking when you have debts owed by the poor to the rich that some debts become a sacred obligation, more important than anything else. The idea of renegotiating them becomes unthinkable. In the past, though, there have been mechanisms when things get to a point of real crisis that have always existed, and they vary by the period of history. In the ancient Middle East, often new kings would simply declare a clean slate and cancel all debts, or all consumer debts. Commercial debts between merchants were often left alone. The Jubilee was a way of institutionalizing that. In the Middle Ages, there were bans on interest-taking entirely. There have been many mechanisms, but whenever you have what I call a period of virtual credit money, when money is recognized not to be a thing like gold and silver, but a social relation, a promise that people make to each other, which has become increasingly clear since the 70s when we went off the gold standard, and I think 2008 really brought that home. Debts can be renegotiated. They're not set in stone. Trillions of dollars of debt was made to disappear. We understand now that this is a political arrangement, and it can always be readjusted. And I think what the people coming to the squares, and Wall Street now included, are saying is that, well, if that's true, if democracy is going to mean anything now, we're all going to have to be able to weigh in on what sort of promises are made and what sort of promises are adjusted when you enter into a crisis.
We hear about debt cancellation when we're talking about developing nations. What about the United States?
Well, the interesting thing is that most of the developing nations have actually pulled themselves out of this situation. It's structural adjustment has come home to Europe and America. I think it would be a great idea. I think it would bring home that we really are in a different age, that money doesn't mean the same thing as it used to. And there are people who've tried it. Saudi Arabia, actually, most dramatically, that was their reaction to the Arab Spring. They declared a debt cancellation. So there are precedents. I mean, they kind of don't want people to know that they did it for obvious reasons, but they did.
And the crisis now in Europe?
The crisis now in Europe is an example of the same thing. The austerity regimes that are being imposed now on Europe and on America are remarkably similar to what happened, what used to be called the Third World Debt Crisis. First, you declare a financial crisis. You bring in these people who are supposedly neutral technocrats who are in fact enforcing this extreme neoliberal ideology. You bypass all democratic accountability and impose things that no one ever possibly have agreed to. It's the same thing. And one reason it's happening to us now is that there was really successful mobilization around the world against those policies.
That's direct from Democracy Now's studio after David Graeber's death last year. A very good friend of ours, especially through his widow, Nika Dubrovsky, an incredibly important thinker for our generation, somebody who addressed the economic sources of the rebellions we've seen all around the world, as well as the other societal ones as an anthropologist.